One of the issues we face in the peace movement and have for a long time is how our demands, which have been in place for a long time, are hitting the political scene. The parliamentary debate, hitting the parliamentary scene. We've had the long time position of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan and from overseas mobilizations. We've had a long time position about the remaking of Canada's role in the Middle East, particularly the balance between the alignment with Israel and Palestine. We've had a long time position of supporting a multipolar world order, extending the capacity of democratic sovereignty of states. We've had a long time position of pulling out of military alliances, particularly NATO, but also NORAD. We've had a long time position against military spending. And then we face the question of the political scene as it exists and the political forces that have lined up in relationship to these issues. And we've seen, although we were quite right on the pulling out of Afghanistan, the opposition to Afghanistan, most of our other positions have little traction in the political scene right now. And in fact, we know that the main forces aligning in Canada, the political and economic elites, are actually moving quite against that agenda. And they're coupling being against that agenda with the position around the internationalization of Canadian capital and things such as the World Trade Organization, the Free Trade Agreement, and so on. So it is quite true that those of us who've been active in the peace movement at different points in time, and those of you today very active right now on those issues, have a goal and objective of broadening out those active on those issues. But we also have to think seriously about the political alignment of those issues. And we face the additional difficulty that the traditional allies of some of those positions are no longer allied with us. Particularly, and this isn't just specific to Canada, it's an international development. That is the shift of left liberal and social democratic forces that are now quite aligned very differently on these issues. As the rethinking about the withdrawal position of NATO that's going on in the NDP, the rethinking of kind of the role of the Canadian military in the Arctic and other places, the rethinking of peacekeeping. And that rethinking and political realignment that's occurring in those forces is quite clearly linked to the way that rethinking is going on around economic matters. That is, the way that Canada should align itself on free trade agreements, the way it should align itself in relationship to democratic controls over corporations, the way it lines itself up on the role it should play in the internationalization of capital. And we have to think that through. And that is inevitably, if one stands for peace, in my thinking, is also standing in relationship to those political forces. And we have to ask ourselves tough questions about those issues. The main dominant forces right now in our society and where they're heading has to really be critically assessed, because they're heading in the other direction. They're heading in a more authoritarian state direction, anti-democratic state, a more state that's more in defense of the internationalization of capital, a state that is more about the increased expenditures around security apparatuses and domestic policing, and doubling up on arms expenditures. And so we have to think ourselves in relationship to that. The final thing, the question I'll address, is what this means, the changing role of Canada in terms of its policies of shifting from peacekeeping to the various kinds of ways it's deployed now. I think that this has something to do with the way that Canada has always fit within, and Canadian foreign policy has fit within the international geopolitical forces, right? We are a state that is born out of colonialism, that is from the get-go a state born of a military offensive. In the first instance, obviously the military offensive against the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And it's always been a state in defense of the internationalization of capital. That is what Canada comes out of. And it was aligned within those main political forces, geopolitical forces, whether it's Britain, France, and now the US. That's where it aligns. Now, over the last 4 decades, we've seen some of the shifting around what this has meant in terms of Canada's role. At one point in time, our key role was playing as a diplomatic adjunct to American initiatives and smoothing out aspects of American diplomacy. Then we played a key role supplementing that by peacekeeping and attempting to play a key role in resolving conflicts. Now our role has shifted. We've broken with both of those. Our key role now, where we specialize in, is particularly playing a role in supporting the development of police and security apparatuses in the countries of conflict. That's the role in Afghanistan, that's the role in Palestine, that's the role in Haiti, that's the role in Central America. And our military portion of this has also shifted its strategic capacity to be able to do that. So we can engage in military actions in multiple fronts in multiple ways. So, we have to rethink and keep in mind the way that overall political balance of power has shifted, the way this links to the developments within the broader class and political structure of Canada, and the way it means right now for the trajectory of and the development of Canadian foreign policy today. This has something to do with Harper and where Harper's push things, but it isn't limited to Harper. It was there under the Chrétien-Martin government, and the NDP has largely accommodated itself to that. So if we want to return back to those issues of what has been the main platform, and is a platform I think that all of us agree with, of the peace movement, we can't but also think of our own political views and how we line up along those things.
To respond to just a couple points that were raised, and but I'll just echo Grace's point, which is a very important one about the fact that Canada is born as a colonial settler state, and I think if you're going to take seriously the power of the Canadian state in its historical development, but also the power of Canadian corporations and Canadian capital in its historical development, I think that's an important context that is ever present in framing what Canadian state capital are doing abroad, at home and abroad. And it's not an accident that in the natural resources sector, in particular abroad, a lot of the conflict that Canadian companies are engaged in and the Canadian state is supporting involves Indigenous communities as well. So that's very important to consider, and it's something that actually I talked a bit about in my book Imperialist Canada. Sort of like it's a contemporary form of Canadian imperialism has long historical roots that are at the core of what the Canadian state project is, and tied into that too is also an extremely racist nature of the Canadian state. The Canadian state is in Canadian state power. It is a very racialized process. It's not race neutral what the Canadian state does at home or abroad. That frames capital accumulation, and so it frames state power. And those are very important things. And I think that some of the leading resistance against Canadian state power, in fact, in Canadian capital, at home and abroad is by Indigenous peoples. Okay. So I'll just very quickly comment on a comment that was made around Canada's rewriting of mining codes. That's an excellent point. I didn't raise that in my presentation, but it is something that I've talked about elsewhere. It's very, very central to what Canada has been doing in terms of its foreign policy. It's foreign policy in both what still is actually called CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency, which is now part of Foreign Affairs. But part of CEDA when it was more or less independent of Foreign Affairs, but also was part of Foreign Affairs even before CEDA was part of Foreign Affairs. So basically two bodies. In fact, if you look at, as I spent way too much time doing in preparing another book that I'm writing with some Jeff Weber on Canadian imperialism in Latin America specifically, spent way too much time reading access to information documents from various embassies in Latin America. What you find is that Foreign Affairs, CEDA, and Natural Resources Canada play absolutely key roles in various countries in Latin America in pushing forward certain reforms or modernization, whatever buzzword they might use, but really neoliberalization of mining codes, But not only that, funding the embassies do this as well, funding government officials in various countries, including countries that are kind of on the fence about how much they really want Canadian money, to come to Canada, to the Prospectors Developers Association of Canada annual meetings, the biggest such meetings in the world, to meet with Canadian officials, to meet with Canadian mining companies, and to meet with Canadian Indigenous peoples who are sympathetic to Canadian mining, and so on. And what you also get is funding to train people in various ministries and to train future workers in these countries to be able to work in the natural resources sector for Canadian capital. So it's a very central part of what Canadian foreign policy is doing. And I've tried to do a little bit of information on Afghanistan, and the Canadian government is not particularly forthcoming with documents on that matter. My guess, though, is that there probably is something going on. I can't say beyond that, because it's really only just speculation. But it's a kind of educated speculation insofar as they're doing it in so many different places, why wouldn't they be doing it there? So that's very important indeed. And it's part of the sort of whole of government approach. And I use it as a segue into the second thing I was going to respond to, which was Rebecca's question about the rationale behind training security apparati in parts of Latin America. And places in Latin America where they are, so obviously Afghanistan, they're very tied to the Afghan security apparatus, but also places in Latin America like Haiti, Colombia, to some degree Peru, Guatemala, Honduras. I think there's sort of two kind of related reasons why they do it. One is it's like they're training the security apparatus that will or has been and will continue to defend Canadian investment. Because Canadian investment is resisted in most places, particularly in the natural resources sector, where it goes, and so local communities are affected by this, and so they challenge it. In some cases, they challenge it with a lot of militant, creative militancy and defiance, as everybody knows, blockading roads and so on, access to development projects, and the police are called in, and there's lots of instances in the last little while of this, particularly in Guatemala, where they're very forcefully evicted or blockades taken down in the last, since 2006, I think it's 2009, there's been, by my count, 15 people in Latin America murdered by security forces opposing Canadian mining projects. So I'm not even counting Africa, I'm talking about Latin America. And those are security apparatus that Canadian security forces, some of which are being trained, or some of which are being trained currently by Canadian security forces. So there's that, the direct one. Then there's this sort of indirect component to it, which is Canada is, and Greg was sort of alluding to this, Canada is committed to the broader sort of global capitalist framework, neoliberal framework for accumulation. It is tied into it, that includes other advanced capitalist countries, and so it sees itself as playing a role in helping to set the conditions for that and to reproducing that. And so part of that is training security apparatus in various countries, which may or may not directly benefit Canadian companies in Latin America. It usually does, but I think they also see it as part of this broader project. We are a really valuable part of the global north, and so this is one of our roles and responsibilities, is to do things like that. And I think, but also tied into that, and my last point is, if you're spending the state, if Canadian capital is spending a lot of money, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in Latin America and billions more elsewhere, and the Canadian state is also spending a lot of money in terms of its diplomatic efforts to support, which it does in very much, Canadian capital. And CETA is spending money to the tune of, in about a decade or so, from late 2009 to basically 2020, so projected $200 million CETA spending for mining projects alone, most of which is actually in Latin America. So if they're spending that much money and they're training people and so on, then it just makes sense that, like, they'll use, to quote the Canadian government, a whole of government approach to this agenda. And that includes foreign affairs, CETA, Natural Resources Canada, and RCMP and national defense. I'll just say last point is that one of the covers they use is the war on drugs. So they're using that in Central America and Mexico. I don't think people should believe it. I think there's maybe a little bit of that, but the war on drugs also gives them an excuse to work with security apparatus in various countries, but also the war on drugs itself, as a number of observers have pointed out, is also about not drugs, but facilitating capital accumulation in tourism, natural resource sector, because it targets communities in the name of the war on drugs that happen to be on, near, or adjacent to areas and geographies that are rich in natural resources or prime for tourist development. So, I'll leave it at that.
I don't think I will be talking or commenting on some of the points that Todd and Greg highlighted, but there were a few things that I wanted to mention. I guess one of the important things was what are the lessons for the peace movement post-Canada's withdrawal from Afghanistan right now. I think the last 13 years in Afghanistan has created a particular perception of Canada in Afghanistan and in the Middle East in general, and increasingly under Harper, now that the Canadian government is engaged in selling weaponry to Gulf states, there is a perception that Canada is involved in fueling conflict more domestically in these states, but in the region in general. So it's quite important that we are not really post-withdrawal. The conflict is ongoing, but different types of conflict, and Canada is still involved in that. So it's quite important to become more aware about this role that Canada has developed over the last decade in terms of with the military's kind of posturing in the region. And I think it's quite important, having talked to some of the activist groups in Afghanistan and the Middle East in general, that perhaps if we establish more of a networking or collaboration with other groups in these countries who are quite isolated from the Canadian Peace Alliance or other peace movements in North America. I know that Malala Joya, for example, has been touring and promoting her book, but if we can establish more connections with them and show support to them, and probably not just moral support, but emotional, material support, if we can maybe send people there in parts that are peaceful and work with them in developing their capacities. For example, in the case of women's groups, maternal health in Afghanistan and in various provinces, there's huge demands for some kind of support knowledge, for instance, as to what they could do. And the government, like I mentioned, we do not have the resources to allocate to these groups. And so women's role in society is quite deeply hampered by lack of those resources, whether it's knowledge, whether it's support. So there could be areas that could be expanded. I guess I'm thinking of broadly other roles for the peace movement beside protesting and opposition to war and conflict. So more of creating an alternative vision of Canadian citizens of the world and what they could possibly contribute towards peace in these countries. So that was, I think, one of the main points. And just touching on Canada's role in developing or writing legislation, Canada has been quite deeply involved, actually. If you look at the history of it since the 1960s onwards, in writing, being, I guess, Empire's ally, doing all these administrative development, institutional development in various countries, especially in the global south. And in the case of Afghanistan and some of the other countries, they are writing, drafting legislation, and I guess presenting knowledge from the north as the knowledge that is the right knowledge, and that will develop these countries and move them forward. So sadly, there aren't many people, well-trained, I guess, intellectuals in Afghanistan, so there is that vacuum that's being filled now by Canada. So a particular kind of blueprint is put in place that will determine the long-term development of these countries. So it's quite important to keep an eye on what will be the outcome of these and how, I guess, that could be diverted. So I guess I'll just leave it at that, but those were some of the points that I thought we should mention.
Great, so I'm going to focus on the lessons for the peace movement as well, and I think there are 4 kind of lessons. One is that mobilization is essential, that we wouldn't have been able to force the Canadian government to stay officially out of the war in Iraq without mobilization, and arguably the debate that has dogged governments involved in the occupation of Afghanistan would not have happened if it hadn't been for the anti-war movements internationally. The second lesson, I think, is that we have to make links, and ultimately, foreign policy is not just about war and diplomacy, as Todd has very clearly explained. And also, war is not just about killing people. It's not the fact that, it's not the case that governments go, let's go kill some people, and there's no particular reason behind it. Like, there's a reason why wars are being waged. And that's what books like Empire's Ally are trying to get at. It's not about trying to deliver a conclusion that we expect movements in general to just accept at face value. It's about contributing to a conversation that's about achieving a deeper understanding of what's actually driving forces that are advocating for military intervention, colonialism, exploitation, extraction, subjugation, all the things, the bad things that our states do internationally that hurt other people. And then the last thing I want to say is that, I guess maybe to try to end on a bit of a light note, that if Canada is drafting legislation, that is not a good thing, because I don't know if you've read any Canadian laws lately, but a lot of them are complete gibberish. So this doesn't bode well for international law. That's where I'll end.
Okay, so thank you to all the panelists for their excellent contributions and for coming here, Artist Dimension, and thanks again to all of you for being part of the discussion.